Hello, friends. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me with some special guests today to talk about, as we enter 2026, what the landscape of our industry looks like. I know that you guys, like me, are closely following the news to figure out a lot of noise and whether that noise translates into actual issues or what do we do in the meantime. And I have called this one of the squirreliest, that's my word of the year, one of the squirreliest years that we have seen in our industry, even comparing to right after COVID, because even though COVID was bad, but it was consistently bad, squirrely to me means that it's hard to wrap your head around what segments of the industry are affected and why, and what the commonalities are and what we can do about it. So there's a little opener for me. I would like to start by telling you guys a couple of things. You are during the webinar today, you're going to see 3 polls. You'll notice to the right of your screen where it says polls. They should pop up on your screen. But this is us, as we did at our Shift conference, collecting data to share with you guys about how other companies are behaving right now. And hopefully those are comparable to the 500 or so that we had at Shift. We have 570 friends on with us today. So thank you for joining. And we know that there is a lot to think about right now and a lot to plan for. So we appreciate you being here with us. I'm so happy to introduce 2 people that I respect tremendously and really like. They're just good human beings. We have followed each other around now for, I think we just did our 8th annual Shift event. They've been with us for the last 6 of those. And Phil Vaccaro and Malavika have joined us with research in the industry to help us all understand on a macro level what's going on. So I will ask them to introduce themselves, but I also want to say that they are out of town, traveling, at a conference, making it happen from hotel rooms. And we just really appreciate the effort they go through to support you guys and us with information that helps us make better decisions. So hello, Phil.
So I'll just introduce the 2 of us, and then we're gonna share the presentation. So Phil Vaccaro and Malavika Dhawan, we are partners at EY-Parthenon, and we work in our education strategy and private equity practices. We've both been at the firm for a long time. We have done a lot of work in the early childhood education space now for over a decade. I met Kathy in 2019 at an investor conference, and we have pursued this great relationship since then. And we, as always, Kathy, appreciate the opportunity to come here and present to your audience. You are a great caretaker for the sector, and we appreciate you.
Thank you for being here, guys. If we can, are we gonna, were you introducing on behalf of both of you guys? Okay, yes. Good to go. We're gonna hear from you in a minute, Malavika. So if we can launch our polls, so we would like to get started with a couple of polls, and I'm gonna pitch to Phil to lead us through this process. So over to you, Phil.
Great. So I'll read the poll, and then I'll just do a little bit of a voiceover as folks respond. But we are trying to assess what demand looks like out in the market today. So the first polling question: compared to last year, demand for childcare at your center is much stronger, slightly stronger, about the same, slightly weaker, and much weaker. So as you all respond, we are going to offer our perspective on what the market looks like now, and at least in general terms, try to capture what our research suggests about the state of the market today, including what it takes to compete successfully in today's market, and what some of the challenges and opportunities may be. As we look at the real-time responses to the polling questions, one thing that I would note here is certainly there's a range of responses. And as an industry that represents the full 50 states, clearly we are going to see a differentiated experience across markets and across organizations. But if you look on the whole, the results do seem to skew or indicate that the market is a little bit more challenging currently, with more folks reporting about the same, slightly weaker and much weaker. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the factors that contribute to these trends, but this is unfortunately consistent with some of the other polling that we have done recently. So second question, how optimistic do you feel about the early childhood education market over the next 12 months? So a lot of what we have to share is based on what recent trends have been, but we're also trying to capture feedback on what the outlook for the sector is. And one of the things that we try to do is, as we understand the factors that drive the market overall, what are our projections for those factors over the next 12 months? And then compare that against, what you all are experiencing and what outlook you all have as it relates to your specific markets. Again, here it looks like a variety of responses, with sort of maybe a slightly bimodal distribution here, but generally speaking, the biggest category here does skew negative. Somewhat pessimistic is around 44%. Fortunately, the very pessimistic is only 6% here, but overall, I think the net feedback does skew slightly negative. And again, unfortunately, the first part of this presentation is probably going to be a little bit more on the somber side, but Malavika is going to pick us up toward the end and offer hopefully some solutions that or some areas to focus on as we end the presentation. So there's one more polling question. Which of the following operational areas could benefit most from better technology or automation, if any? So A, staff scheduling and rostering, B, enrollment management and CRM, customer relationship management, C, billing and finance, including subsidy reimbursement, D, classroom curriculum tracking, and E, reporting. Malavika and I actually happened to be at an EY conference on AI, and learning about which industries have been adopting AI more rapidly than others. Generally speaking, education has historically and continues to be a laggard in that regard. There are some clear sort of software tools that are in use by the early childhood education sector. We know in talking to the folks who run some of those organizations that they are actively trying to integrate AI into their solutions. And so this is sort of, a good indicator for us and maybe to them in the areas where better technology or automation may be needed and ultimately supported by AI. So staff scheduling and rostering, enrollment management and CRM, and billing and finance are the three that popped here, and that do lend themselves well to strategic solutions that can be certainly informed and enabled by AI. So thank you for the real-time reporting here. We've captured these results and may integrate that into some of our future research, but just wanted to start by taking the pulse of folks on the line to get a sense for the experience that you all are having. So we're going to get into the presentation now, and if any of you were at the Shift conference, this may look familiar, although I see that my old picture is being used here, which was taken 15 years ago, which I'm not going to complain about. We're going to spend the next 35 minutes talking about the early childhood education market trends and outlook. So if we go to the next slide and then actually pass the disclaimer, just really quickly about EY-Parthenon, we do see the market from a number of different angles. We work with investors, we work with providers, and we work with government organizations. So we really do see the early childhood education market from different entry points, which hopefully allows us to bring a comprehensive view to these kinds of sessions. So if we keep going, we're going to talk to you today about some perspectives on the market, and this will be, probably the more somber part of the presentation, and then Malavika will take us through meeting the demands of the moment. So if we go to the next slide, and if we look back out on the last 5 years, and so 2020 pre-COVID is a natural starting point here. It's also the first year that we joined Kathy for the Shift conference, and it was in February of that year, right before the world changed with COVID in March. But in many ways, 2020 did represent a bit of a peak for the market. Really strong performance. Apex had just announced its purchase of Cadence. There was a lot of market activity, and the big issue of the day was $15 minimum wage. So a lot has certainly changed since then. 2021, we had COVID, market shutdown, center closures, federal funding, and then toward the end of the year, some initial recovery that went into 22, went into 23. Clearly, that we had a lot of return to work dynamics that were affecting different industries differently, and therefore early childhood education centers were experiencing that differently. We had acute labor shortages for sure, and then increased student challenges in terms of behavior and early literacy because of the time away during COVID. But growth did continue into 2023. The stimulus funds did expire, some challenges with business economics in terms of, a lot of it had to do with the relationship between increases in pricing and increases in wages. 2024 and 2025, the experience over those 2 years, based on our research, has been more consistent than the prior years, and on the whole, has been challenging for the market. I think many of us thought that coming out of 2023, that we would continue to see recovery, and maybe we're a little surprised in the fall of 2024 when those trends didn't continue in the same way, and more of the same in 2025. So, we've continued to see a shift in family care needs, mixed response from states with funding support, certainly affordability challenges, and some softer enrollment overall, though examples of strong growth. It is hard to generalize too much about the sector, just given the very local dynamics that do exist. So if we go to the next slide, we're characterizing a little bit of a perfect storm here in terms of the challenges that the industry is facing. We're going to go through those in a second. So what do we have to say about this? Well, one, make sure that we're protecting the core and that we're strong fundamentally. Two, be very clear about the value proposition that you offer as a way to attract and retain families. And then third, really think about sort of your delivery model and back office efficiencies that you might be able to tighten up in a period where the business economics have been a little bit more challenged. And then, of course, from an advocacy standpoint, Kathy alluded to the increasingly complex regulatory environment and decisions that are being made by federal and state governments that are really, complicating the moment. And so, it is a bit of, as I'm sure you all are experiencing, a bit of a complex and confusing and unpredictable time in a sense. Fortunately, there are some pockets of success, some good news. One is the labor market has stabilized a bit, and we hear many fewer providers experiencing staffing concerns. Staffing had been a constraint on growth during the initial recovery from COVID. We don't hear that as much a lot of our research was done at the end of 2025. Positive enrollment signals, number 2 in the middle here, in the younger age groups. So we do see a return to pre-pandemic levels of enrollment of infants and toddlers, with more folks experiencing wait lists in those segments. And then 3, public pre-K has been a bit mixed, but on balance has been favoring mixed delivery. Including options for private providers. So, a page here to acknowledge some of the pockets of success and positive momentum for the sector. So, if we look at the other end, maybe some of the more somber news, overall enrollment is lower this fall than last, as center directors reported decline in center level enrollments and utilization. So, just some data that we've collected. This is survey data, so self-reported from outreach to center directors, but it's a significant enough sample size, and it does seem to comport with anecdotal feedback that we've received. In the fall of 2019, average center utilization was around 70%. That's on the left. Skip a few years, fall 2024, it was about 65% average center utilization, and then dropped to 61%. Now, again, these numbers are not exact, not intended to be exact, but representative of the sample that we were able to survey. But again, this does seem to be validated by the conversations that we've had with folks as well. So certainly challenges broadly for the sector. There's some evidence that regional and national chains have fared slightly better than independents, so this is clearly not universally true, and then sort of mixed results across geographies. So let's start to unpack that a little bit on the next page. We asked center directors what were the primary reasons that enrollment at your center decreased over the last year. And the gray bars represent supply side factors, and the blue bars represent more demand side factors. So the first one, increasing competition from public or private. We're going to have backup slides that correspond to these first 5. So I'll get into more specifics about those in a minute. Increases in tuition. So affordability continues to be a challenge. Remote work and parents exiting the labor force. We know that female participation in the workforce has been historically a significant driver of demand in this sector, and we actually have seen a little bit of a dip in that measure nationally. Decreased subsidies, and then a decrease in the 0 to 5 population, which unfortunately is a national trend. But you do see all the way to the right here, staffing challenges were only reported 14% of the time as a constraint on enrollment. So we are not seeing that nearly to the effect that to the level of significance as we have in the past. So we'll start to take each of these one by one here. So if we go to the next slide, competition for children has increased due to growth in both private childcare and public pre-K seats. And so if you look at total licensed childcare centers by state, and I think this represents capacity over 40 states where we were able to gather data. And we have seen supply going up at about 2% compounded annually. So from about 86,000 to almost 93,000 seats in 2024. So that is certainly significant. And I think there are certain markets in particular that are feeling the effect of that. Massachusetts and Texas actually have experienced even much higher capacity growth, 13% and 8% respectively. So again, geographic specific, but we are seeing more seats available to families right now. And just to the right, how has the number of public pre-K seats changed? Almost 40% report significantly increased, and another 30% saying slightly increased, with only about 30% saying no change or decrease. So on the whole, more supply, which creates some competitive challenges for providers. The second factor is around affordability. And so if we look at historical pricing trends relative to inflation, in the green bars, those are years where tuition growth outpaced change in inflation. And so you can clearly see that first bar actually represents 2000 to 2018, and then 2018 to 2020. So historically, tuition rates have outpaced inflation. It switched a little bit during COVID in 22, 23, roughly the same between tuition growth and inflation. Certainly providers were trying to keep costs down for families as a way to draw them back. But in 23, 24, and 24, 25, tuition growth has once again outpaced inflation and created affordability challenges for families, particularly families that have more than one child in an ECE center. Over to the right, we see that the average tuition increase has been about 4.6% across the sector, and roughly half of the folks reported having increases in tuition above 5% in the last 2 years. So fairly significant, and to be fair, in line with some of the wage inflation that we've seen among childcare workers. So that is the affordability challenge. On the next slide, we show a little bit about what has happened with the workforce. And this shows the share of U.S. workers working from home. And while that peaked at 18% compared to a pre-pandemic level of about 6%, we're not quite there. And 2023 was, I think, the last year we had data, but still substantially higher in 2023, about 14% relative to the historical rate. And our data and our research suggests that work flexibility has sustained into 2025. 20 to 25% of U.S. workers report working from home for pay at least 1 day per week. So that is pretty significant and impacts childcare needs. And again, it affects different sectors differently, but has created a new challenge for providers since COVID. We go to the next one, just talk briefly about subsidies. So centers in states that decrease subsidy funding have seen declines in the share of their students that are subsidy receiving. I guess this is not a surprising finding. In states that have seen a decrease for income-based subsidies, not a huge percentage overall, about 20%. But in those states, it has translated to a decline in the share of enrollment that's supported by subsidies. So that has certainly been a headwind as well. And then the last factor that we will cover on the next page is just the change in the overall population of students age 0 to 5. So in 2015, we had roughly 24 million children in this age range. And we've sort of stabilized into the 22 million range. It is expected to be roughly stable through 2030. There are certainly some of the data out there would suggest that the long-term changes in birth rates are more likely than not to be an ongoing headwind for the sector. But at least for the next few years, we do believe that this population will be roughly stable. So, we just walked through 5 factors that are all real and that are essentially creating a challenging business environment for many providers. We don't necessarily anticipate that many of these will change quickly for the good. The trends that we've seen in 2024, 2025, I think for the most part, we think that those are likely to continue in 2026. And so, that may be the reality for another year or so, but we're going to talk a little bit more about how to respond to the current business environment. So I know Kathy is tracking feedback. Malavika and I are going to do a quick chair shift here. So if you can just forgive us for one. Malavika.
I'll mute it. Appreciate you all bearing with us as I try to look less like a ghost. So thank you, Phil, for moving, and thank you to the Hinge team for having us today. Just want to get a thumbs up that folks can hear me. Yes. I assume at this point someone would have told me they can't. So it is good to see you all. And really appreciate, the opportunity to share some of our reflections. I do want to underscore something Phil said that we all know to be true. This market is ultimately local. And so all of the ideas on the coming pages on how to meet the demands of the moment obviously need to be considered in your local context. But we hope it's good food for thought, and we'd always welcome the opportunity to continue to trade notes even after today's conversation. With that, could we move to the next page? Again, it goes without saying, but early childhood care and education, it's critical infrastructure. It's the backbone of our economic engine. But as Phil shared, we're hearing and seeing in the data really varied experiences. There is no one story for early childhood providers at the moment. And obviously, the headlines over the last few weeks have further complicated some of that dynamic. And in this local market, they're changing family needs, the real affordability challenges, and obviously varied levels of public support and competition. And they've all together just reinforced the importance of getting creative in driving and sustaining enrollment. And so we wanted to share some of the bright spots that we're seeing in optimizing center operations. Move to the next slide. Perfect. So the first is around how we get families in the door and we convert them. We've been hearing from some providers who are getting really creative in how they leverage community events, thinking about drop-in play dates, open houses, but being really expansive in who can attend, not just to build awareness with prospective families, but also for brand building overall, given how important we know word of mouth can be. And to the point of word of mouth, we've also seen several providers increase monetary incentives with referrals, which can be really attractive given some of the pricing challenges that Phil noted. I also know that in the last many years, many of you have invested in some kind of system to help track leads. The question to consider is how far you've pushed that lead system towards analytics. Are you able to pinpoint where in the funnel you're running into conversion challenges? Ultimately, with the hope of driving accountability with your team. And if you haven't yet invested in those solutions, there are many systems that can help make you do that. The second dynamic is how you do more with your space. Phil and I were speaking recently to a provider that's gotten really creative with flexible classroom design. So this particular provider, many of their centers were facing increased competition from public UPK. And so one of their solutions was actually to restructure some of their classrooms to be able to support more twos. They also thought about more flexible schedules, and something they realized through a survey of their staff was that half days were actually an easier way to drive utilization versus a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday schedule, because it allowed staff who maybe didn't want to work the full week some predictability on when they would be called in. So both are potentially opportunities you could consider if you haven't already. And then finally, there's a question of retention. Another provider we worked with recently had fantastic infant toddler enrollment, but a real drop off in preschool. And so they invested in new solutions to help manage the transition. Parents would get outreach from the center director who managed regular family check-ins to the tune of sort of 3 to 4 check-ins in the months ahead of opting into a public pre-K option. And that center director really sat down to talk about the individual student's progress, pathways, build a dialogue with parents, really to ultimately reinforce they knew the student, they knew them well, and signal to parents what they could potentially lose if they opted into the public pre-K option. Now, you all are incredibly smart. You live and breathe this every day. And I suspect you're like, yeah, thanks very much. I do this all the time. And so maybe we can talk about some potential other ideas to expand the funnel and attract new families. Thank you for flipping already. So it wasn't until I lived the experience of finding childcare for my little ones that I appreciated how unbelievably overwhelming the process can be. I have a 5 and a 3-year-old, so it is still top of mind for me every day. And there were so many competing factors my husband and I were considering as we evaluated our options. Some of it was what we needed, schedule, communication. Some of it's what we thought our children needed, the environment, educators. And so with so many good options nearby, I remember listening for what center directors said made them different and distinct. If we flip to the next slide, the last year, if you all joined the presentation that Phil did, we talked a little bit about how parent expectations have changed. And unsurprising to all of you, the core elements are still critical. Facilities, reputation, staff, curriculum, these are the bedrock of this industry and something that every parent is eager to see and listens for when they visit an early childhood center. But even last year, we were beginning to see a trend towards some elevated parent expectations, ultimately with the desire to truly deeply understand a specific provider's value proposition and differentiation. So when we did this research last year, we saw how some providers were tackling this change through convenience, driving home socialization benefits, thinking about investment in communication tools with parents, and in some instances, offering more enrichment. And all of those ideas continue to be relevant, but many of you have actually done all of that. And so in some ways, they've elevated a little bit of what table stakes is. And so what comes next? If we could flip forward to the next page, we would say that this sort of trend of really articulating what makes you special has continued. And we know you all are so special and differentiated in the care and the education that you provide children. There's no silver bullet because local context matters, and you all know very well what parents in your community value. But as we look across the landscape, there have been some themes that have better tied to stronger enrollment. The first is getting really sharp around your pedagogical differences. No one size fits all. Could be forest, could be Montessori, could be STEM, but being really clear around what it is you are doing pedagogically with students. A second bright spot has been in language, particularly with immersion options, and of course, ultimately pricing to reflect that additional support. Given how price has gone up for parents over the last many years, as Phil talked about, this is a clear signal to parents of what they're paying for incrementally. The third is, again, leading into this convenience dimension. How can you be as easy as possible for parents? How can you maybe be the all-in convenient option? And we've noticed that provision of food is really resonating in a time when kids' health is dominating headlines. And then finally, consideration of being sort of flexible first. As Phil talked about, parents are working in multiple places now. And so how can you think about where the before and after care makes sense, whether you want to develop your own backup care sign-up option, or even think about evening events for parents who might have more atypical schedules. Think about medical professionals, for example. Again, no one size fits all, but my takeaway for you would be, how can you articulate what makes you different as simply as possible, as quickly as possible, as short as in a sentence? So that is what parents retain and remember when they finish a tour or they visit your website. If we could flip to the next page. While we're excited and hopeful that there are ways to attract and retain families to grow revenue that you have not yet thought about, we're also increasingly seeing platforms think about how to optimize their cost structure. And I know that's incredibly painful because you all work so hard every day to take care of our children. But if we flip to the next page, it's unfortunately the reality of the moment. It can't be ignored. So if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, the vast majority of centers in our survey are saying that their cost is outpacing their tuition growth. So despite some really meaningful tuition increases, there is still a gap. And it's one of the top concerns that center directors continue to echo for us, with pressure around all dimensions of their cost structure: labor, food, nutrition, facilities costs rising. I'm sure every center director on this phone is like, how can I look in my cost structure? My teams are lean. You want me to look for incremental savings? I get it. I'm certainly not trying to be, Phil and I are not aiming to be the most popular people during our call today, but wanted to share some of what we're seeing. And this is where I would reframe less around how do we cut costs, more how do we think about the opportunity to drive more efficiencies and how directors and teachers are spending their time. If we could quickly flip to the next slide. This is where creativity is a bit of the name of the game. Ultimately, you all want all of your center directors and teachers to be spending their time on the most value additive activities, whether it's focusing more on children or ultimately just spending less time on admin tasks to coach educators. So we've been working with several providers and platforms over the last year on their operations. And there are several dimensions in which automation we found can help really streamline tasks. The first, which I think many of you flagged in the question Phil asked at the top, is, well, where can automation help support invoicing, reimbursement, and in particular, subsidy management? The second is around sort of purchasing and processing, where centralizing some of that and also implementing some automation can really help drive some savings. And then finally, the most important and I think interesting one is to think at a center level how you can be most efficient with the daily tasks that you do. So where can automation technology play a role around scheduling, lead management? I remember many of you, I think the number 1 or 2 response was around CRMs, and then ultimately parent communication. So it's great to talk about the ideas. Let us talk some hard numbers if we flip to the next page. The gains can be really meaningful if you invest in technology and automation at a centralized level. Again, we've worked with some fairly large platforms across the world, and we have seen somewhere in the range of a 20% reduction in labor costs with some back office roles, particularly in finance. We worked with one to redesign a subsidy management function that was primarily done with people. We know it's so challenging to navigate the paper involved. It varies state by state. And for those of you who are international, they're totally different country requirements. But automation was really able to help reduce the time spent on filling out forms and also improving accuracy, ultimately reducing costs. Procurement savings, not as significant, but somewhere in the range of 2 to 5%. And then ultimately the biggest savings were around redefining and reshaping the center level role, really focusing center director time away from administrative tasks, automating and digitizing efforts on scheduling and automation and parent comms, so they could spend time either driving new enrollment and or coaching and supporting educators and parents. If we can flip to the next slide. We spent time with multiple center directors in a large platform. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we actually worked with them to track how they were spending their time. It's really, if you have not done this for yourself, I find it fascinating. It's also kind of horrifying to see how much time I spend on email. But sometimes you just need someone else to force you to monitor how you're spending your time. And what we learned is that 50 to 60% of a center director's time for this particular platform and chain was spent on administrative tasks and not on some of the things you would think would be highest value add, managing the center, interacting with staff, interacting with parents and children. And with that 50% of the time, this particular platform was able to refocus that time through investing in some technology to be able to support center operations. They couldn't redirect all of that time, all 50 to 60%, but even redirecting some of it was able to, at a centralized level, drive some real gains, particularly with new enrollment. If we could flip to the last page, let me end by saying you all have the hardest job in the world, and you have already navigated through so much uncertainty and challenges over the last 5 years. And so as we look across the varied experiences in this ultimately very local market, maybe we can leave you with a few questions, and then we can definitely open it up to hear what questions are top of mind. The first is, in center management fundamentals, are you driving accountability and analytics through your funnel? And what can you do to promote really high-touch efforts at transition points, especially in markets where public pre-K is a competitor? And attracting new families, how can you best articulate what makes you special in a concise way that resonates with families? There's no one answer, there's no right answer, but simplicity is key. And then finally, in financial performance, how can you rethink and maybe redefine how center directors are spending their time through automating some of their less value-added tasks and really driving some digital transformation? We are so excited about continuing to support this industry. It is, as I mentioned earlier, the backbone of our entire economic engine. We continue to be hopeful that there will be more opportunities to meet the demands of parents and families in our ever-changing environment.
Let's take some questions, but again, really appreciate a couple of concepts that you guys talked about. One of those is, what do we have control over? And there is a huge shift from removing administrative tasks from the director to allow the director to focus on enrollment and parent and teacher interaction. So some of the moves along that are to add outside resources. And I know this is easier when you have multiple schools and not just a single school, but when I say outside, I mean outside of the center level to support with hiring and enrolling. So call centers, setting up tours, initial screening of applicants. Those are some of the big trends we see going away from the center director, or getting those functions to a certain point before they get to the center director. So really appreciate that. You guys hop into the chat. And then while you're doing that, I want to tell you one thing. So I do see the question about, will the recording be available? Yes, it will. All of our webinars are available on the Hinge website at hingeadvisors.com. The other thing I wanted to mention was that we are continuing this year our value events. So we did 2 new events last year we called Value. And at Value, our guests are able to work with a Hinge financial analyst team in advance and get a current valuation of their business and real estate. And then at the event, they're coached one-on-one by one of the Hinge team members on what they can do to strengthen their financial picture. And then we have a full day of content around what does that value mean? How can I make it stronger? How can I position myself for an eventual transition of my business or real estate, and what are the options. So we have one in May here in our hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, and we have one in September in California. But you can go to our website and see those dates and get registered there. So we would love to support your growth and or challenges, if you have some, and what is happening with enrollment and cost control. So let's jump over to our chat. We have a question about, we had someone early on want to know how many centers one of the charts was representing and asking if it said 94 across all 50 states. Someone said yes. I'm not sure if you guys know which slide they were referencing, but we'll accept the help we got. That is correct. Is that right?
I think this is referring to total seats, maybe 94,000 seats. If that's the case, then that was, I think, from 40 states where we were able to scrape the data.
Okay. If that did not answer your question, Erin, pop back in here. Martha, yes, we will have this available to watch. We love sharing information. We publish our prices on the website. What are some great groups to connect with other owners or operators that are open and want to info share to make everyone better? Do you guys want to make any comments there? Or you want me to just plug in a few?
Yeah, I mean, why don't you start, Kathy?
Yeah. So Taylor, we see this as well. You know, most companies do not publish their tuition rates. And frankly, you do have to be a little careful about that you're not bumping up against collaboration on price fixing. But most local providers are, one of the things I love about this industry is I've never seen another industry that is so willing to share. They will share what they're doing that's working, what's amazing. And I hear that consistently from others that have operated in other industries. But I think you just reach out to your local market if you would like to know what your competition is doing, and just tell them who you are. You know, I bet that the majority of them will be happy to have a conversation with you. When discussing enrollment winners, could you dive deeper on what about language immersion attracts caregivers or educators to continue supporting a child care? Yeah, that's a great question. Do you guys have any more color around what is it about language immersion? I have an opinion, but you probably have research, so I'll let you go first.
I'm happy to start, and Pauline, happy to take this conversation offline as well if we can learn a little bit more about where you're located. I'm going to give you the most consultant answer ever, which is it depends. It depends on your local context. So I am not today, but normally based in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And there, the languages that really resonate with parents are Mandarin and Spanish. That is different than my hometown of Dayton, Ohio. But that answers more of the parent question. And if I'm reading your question, you're also thinking about caregivers and educators. I think something that this industry is always thinking about is how do we continue to support professional pathways and growth? And how do we continue to move the industry away from just thinking about care, but thinking about care and education holistically? And so where immersion winners have done really well is they've been able to tell this story of a journey from just care into care and education, and often find and build educator pathways. You could think about where assistant and lead teachers also make sense even within a center, which ultimately helps attract and retain those caregivers and educators. Phil, is there more you would add?
I think that was great.
Okay, great. I'll add to that we have worked heavily in the language immersion community the last 5 to 7 years. And it appears to us that increasingly this parent base appreciates the education for their children around multiple languages and culture education. They really are intent on wanting their children to know more about others who are different and to know more about the world. So we see that population base growing. And then, of course, like Malavika mentioned, if you look at different geographical areas, then you have different pockets of communities that want their children to learn other languages, and even non-English speaking communities want their children to learn English. So you do see a real growing interest in that arena. So we've had a lot of demand for that. I love the question, has Hinge or other researchers explored the dynamics in specific market niches, so outdoor and nature-based programs? I would say in general that for us, this has been one of the most frustrating parts of this change in enrollment. Because for us, we are struggling to come up with very many commonalities. We can't tie it directly to the size of the company, to the market they operate in, to the state they operate in, to the type of school, whether it's Montessori or Reggio or nature-based or language immersion or so we are really struggling to come up with a direct link from enrollment trends to the specifics of the program. Phil and Malavika, anything to add there?
You know, at the end of the day, and Malavika alluded to this, it's about differentiation and being able to tell a story as to what you stand for and what your kind of experience you're going to provide to families. And so, you know, again, getting back to the local dynamics here, you know, what are the families in your market want? What are they asking for? What can you provide that's different than what's already being provided? So I don't know that we have anything specific to some of that, you know, the outdoor dynamics or related, but you know, I think that this is very much taking a survey of what your local market looks like and what parents in that market want, and trying to put those together as best as possible. You cannot be all things to all people, so you know you do have to pick. If you want to go in for one of these more sort of theme-based or specific market segments. So, you know, but I think most models can find success in some areas. You know, the ones that we see more commonly, the language immersion, Montessori, are at least two examples. Sometimes STEM or STEAM, although sometimes we see that as more of a branding thing than actual follow through on the centers themselves. So those are a few thoughts there, Kathy.
Great, thank you for that. Let's take one more question. I really love this question too. So this is a great one to end with from Matt. Matt would like to know what benchmark metrics you can provide on enrollment retention. And how is this being calculated? I would love for there to be a standard answer for that question, but I'm guessing there isn't, but I'll pitch to you guys. Any thoughts there?
So I'd say first, I don't think there's a standard answer in terms of how everyone calculates this. Some providers will look at what's retention after a year of a child being enrolled. Some will think about actually of the children who enrolled in a single calendar year, how many stay the next year. So one, I think there's a real opportunity in the landscape to standardize how we measure this. If we're talking about parent and family retention, we tend to see pretty high retention between infant and toddler. So that tends to often be infant classrooms to toddler classrooms. That tends to be on average, if I'm thinking about the providers I've looked at, in the 80% plus retention, you know, if once accounting for families who might have moved away. So really thinking about folks who stayed in the community but might have, you know, elected another option, that number tends to be pretty small. Then retention between toddler and preschool classrooms varies so much based on your local context. It is much lower in places where public pre-K is a formidable competitor, but much higher in places where that's not the case. So I'm not sure I have a great percentage there that you would think of, or a way to generalize across 0 to 5.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I would be hard pressed to generalize, but I do think it underscores the importance of working with families through these transition points. So, families are going to be making a decision roughly at the same time as to what their plans are for the next year. And so how are you getting out in front of that conversation to be able to influence their decision? It may be the case that there's not much that you can do. But, really, starting from the beginning of the experience and providing a great experience to families is certainly the best way to retain them, continuity with staffing and so forth. So, but I don't have anything else to add by way of benchmarks.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for that. We are at the end of our hour, and I want to thank our community for joining us in this very important conversation. You'll be hearing more from the HINGE team throughout the next couple of months. We'd love to hear from you as well. And I can't thank you enough, Phil and Malavika, not just for the work that you do, but for the time that you volunteer to share with our community and help support with not just statistics, but actionable items that they can use to make their business and then our education community stronger. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. We appreciate the ongoing partnership, Kathy.
Thanks. We'll see you guys soon. Take care and be well, everyone.
Good to see you all.